There are two early medieval writers in Britain who give us any detail about the early Anglo-Saxon period. There is Bede, an 8th century Northumbrian monk, and Gildas, a 6th century British monk. Both of these writers have a broadly similar narrative. Germanic warriors come as mercenaries to help the native British, who are suffering from abandonment by Rome. But ultimately, they betray the native British and take the land for themselves, establishing kingdoms in the island's east. This forces the British to flee Britain or into hiding until they can defend themselves, at which point they establish kingdoms in the island's west. Both Bede and Gildas are writing about events far out of living memory, centuries ago, and they're writing about these events through their own cultural, religious and political reference points. Imagine if Bede wrote in modern New York, and Gildas wrote in 19th century Los Angeles. They both wanted to write about events of the 7 Years' War between France and Britain. After the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution, all of which were immensely influential on the world and how humans saw themselves. While they may get some details correct, their narratives would be so defined and influenced by events and perspectives after the 7 Years' War that their usefulness would be very limited. It would tell us more about the times in which they wrote than about the 7 Years' War. This is the case for Bede and Gildas. Their writings have been heavily influenced by their world, a world which took form after the 5th century. They superimpose kings and kingdoms in the past where they did not yet exist. They attribute the construction of the Antonine and Hadrian's walls to the 5th century when they were constructed in the 2nd century. They just did not know what the 5th century world looked like. Recent archaeological and genetic evidence sheds light on this period and tells us that the 5th century image was, in a word, complicated. Far more complicated than Gildas and Bede make it seem. It is expected that they oversimplify. Nobody can claim to give the full history of the 5th century. People may have fought, as Bede and Gildas describe, but this was only one factor. Land was acquired in other ways as well, by diplomacy and trade. It would be flat out unreasonable to say that it was not. The clear-cut divide between the British and Germanic arrivals is almost certainly imagined by later generations. But for all of their oversimplifications, it's important to remember that Bede and Gildas did not aim to investigate how Germanic culture became dominant in Britain. For both of them, this was background information for the true aim of their narratives. Gildas was writing of the ruin of Britain, a spiritual journey of the Romano-British, urging people to stop sinning. Bede was writing the church history of the English people, aiming to explain how a pagan culture was converted to Christianity. Neither, even if they were able, wished to closely examine the 5th century period. The narrative allows Christians to explain away a difficult fact. Non-Christian culture supplanted Christian culture after the end of Roman Britain. Pagans were as good as devil worshippers to Bede and Gildas, and after conversion were a source of embarrassment for the elite of Anglo-Saxon society. How could God allow devil worshippers to replace Christians? The only logical answer, in their Christian framework, is that they were replacing bad Christians. The Saxons, as Bede and Gildas called the Germanic arrivals, were warriors who came to slaughter bad Christians to make God teach them a lesson. Gildas wrote first, and his narrative comes from his work, titled On the Ruin of Britain. It's a sermon which condemns the behaviours of Gildas's contemporaries. Gildas wanted to make sure his contemporaries thought that sinning had doomed them before, and if they continued their treacherous ways, God would need to punish them with outright extinction. We know that Gildas didn't aim to question the arrival of Saxons, but more so, Gildas didn't even intend to be a historical record. Because he aims to make his contemporaries behave, his narrative's interactions with the events of the past are only relevant to this aim. It was written in a tradition where history, ethical teaching and theology were not separable. He makes well over 400 biblical references and allusions, drawing analogues to the Bible at every opportunity. This is, after all, how you would convince your peers in the church. He refers to the burning of Roman cities by the Saxon pagans, and then explicitly relates this to the biblical destruction of Jerusalem and slaughter of sinful Jews by Nebuchadnezzar. There is no evidence for the siege of Roman cities leading to their abandonment. They were gutted of their valuable metals, and individuals simply moved away. That Gildas relates this so explicitly to a biblical event leads us to believe that the Bible is Gildas's only source for this. He intends less to record the facts of the 5th century than to find parallels for it in the Bible. After telling how God had punished bad behaviour, he appeals to a story which was probably well known in British areas at the time. The story of Ambrosius Aurelianus, the only 5th century person in his whole narrative that is explicitly named. The British are spared extinction thanks to Ambrosius, as they at last demonstrate piety. At the Battle of Badon Hill, an unknown location, the Saxons were indiscriminately slaughtered. It's likely that this is a folkloric character who was supplanted in later accounts with the name Arthur. Gildas doesn't linger on this well-known story, though. He immediately compares this great man with his contemporaries, who are greatly inferior to their grandfather's excellence. Under him, our people regained their strength and challenged victors to battle. The Lord assented, and the battle went away. It's not unreasonable to perceive that, to make his argument more clear, Gildas is greatly overemphasizing and probably inventing the scale of conflict, war, and extinction that the native British faced. Gildas doesn't value the past for its own sake. He is appealing to a probably well-known story to change minds in the British Church. That was his aim. We don't know when Gildas wrote, but most estimates place him solidly in the 6th century, which means that Gildas is separated from the events he is describing by between 100 and 150 years, between 4 and 6 generations. This is long enough for stories, like Ambrosius, to circulate. More importantly, however, he's writing in the far west about events which occurred in the far east. I've discussed this before, but east-west travel in this period was difficult. Roman roads were in a state of disrepair. This means that not only is Gildas separated from the events he describes, but he has likely had very little direct exposure to Germanic culture at all. Gildas has heard exaggerated accounts of immigration, with no knowledge of how many Germanic arrivals there actually were, or how many were warriors. He has heard folkloric tales of Ambrosius. His work is entirely dependent upon exaggerated hearsay from other people, who themselves have had little to no direct experience of Germanic arrivals. This hearsay was, by his time, out of living memory. Small skirmishes displacing few people could, over time and over distance, become exaggerated into climactic warfare and slaughter. Gildas's account and its exaggerations were operating on accounts which were already heavily embellished or even totally fabricated. Bede writes his account of a Saxon invasion in his Church History of the English People, where he analyses the process by which Saxon people in Britain became Christian. As part of its context, he obviously needs to discuss Roman Britain, its rise and fall, and explain why the Saxon invaders weren't Christian in the first place. In most of his work, he analyses a variety of sources and considers varying perspectives. But in this context, he does not apply the same analytical perspective. Bede lifts ideas and statements entirely from Gildas's polemic. It's clear from even a cursory look that Gildas's polemic is Bede's main source. At times, Bede corrects Gildas, but these corrections are rare and aren't necessarily correct. This tells us that Bede himself didn't know much about the 5th century outside of Gildas's work. Bede, after a long, detailed description of the British, how the Romans left them, and how they were immensely lazy, tells us that in the year 449, the king Vortigern had sought mercenaries from across the sea. 3 ships had pulled ashore on the east of Britain, and the men aboard these ships were heathen warriors that had arrived from the Germanic world, led by 2 men, Hengist and Horsa. These were the people invited to defend the Christian inhabitants of Britain against invasion. At this, we're told they succeeded. Invaders were repelled, and the heathen warriors were paid for their fealty with land. But the warriors were wily. They sent messages to their homeland, saying that their benefactors were rich, and were unable, or more suitably, unwilling, to fight. More warriors arrived under the pretense of loyalty, but their real intention was conquest. The warriors negotiated a greater share of land until, at the hands of heathen warriors, all cities and neighbourhoods from east to west were subjected to siege. With no one to hinder them, the warriors destroyed the whole face of the doomed island. Bede is unfamiliar with the 5th century. Subsequent events have overshadowed the 5th century history. Stable kingdoms came to define the social and political framework of Britain that Bede knew in the 6th century and beyond. Bede lived in a time which was defined by Christendom, established kingdoms and warfare, which was markedly different to the world of the 5th century, just as that was markedly different to Roman Britain. But all are understood by Bede through the same cultural lens. Bede and Gildas's narratives, as we can see, are flawed. Neither of them understood the 5th century world about which they were writing. But this didn't matter much, because from a Christian perspective, for them and for others, the narratives explained how and why non-Christian culture could be allowed by God to overrun Christian culture. Anything more complicated would mean that some people made the choice to become pagan, which to Bede and Gildas was absolutely unthinkable. Even if they knew that the true image was much more complicated, Bede's narrative, together with Gildas's, was convenient. Their narrative accounts tell us much more about how Christians wanted to see their past, than how the past actually occurred. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please check out my other videos on Anglo-Saxon Britain in the playlist on the left. On the right, there's what YouTube thinks you might like. You can subscribe, follow me on Twitter, or support me on Patreon for early access to videos like this. Again, thank you.